Welcome back to This Week in Immigration. I'm Jordan Lapierre. This week, unpacking the immigration messages in the State of the Union, how the presidential election in El Salvador may affect migration, and what the case of rapper 21 Savage says about our immigration system. All that just ahead. Before we get started, please remember you can subscribe to this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you leave a review, it'll help more people find our show. You can also stream This Week in Immigration on our website at bipartisanpolicy.org/podcasts. And as always, check out bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration for more information on the stories we discuss here on the show. And here with me today are Teresa Cardinal-Brown, Director of Immigration and Cross-Border Policy. Hi, Teresa.
Hi, Jordan.
And Chris Ramone, Immigration Policy Analyst. Hi, Chris.
How's it going?
I'm good, thanks. I'll also add that you can find Teresa on Twitter at BPC_T_Brown, and Chris is at CRamoneBPC. Let's start with last week's State of the Union. President Trump spent a large chunk of the speech on immigration and restated many of the same points we heard in his two other national addresses on the topic. Teresa, was there anything that stood out to you about or surprised you about the speech?
I guess, many of us were kind of hoping that in the middle of the negotiations to try to keep the government open, he would have offered a little bit more conciliatory tone on the need for the border wall and what he was looking for. But instead, it was very much a traditional Trump immigration speech, very similar to his stump speeches on the campaign trail and his rallies. He talked about, caravans and criminals and gangs and, a lot of the harsh rhetoric that has caused a lot of difficulty in getting bipartisan agreement on some of the things that we need to do on immigration. So in terms of, what he said, I don't think that there was much new there. The one maybe rhetorical flourish that he did that was somewhat different from what he'd done before is try to make a very significant distinction between legal immigration and illegal immigration, saying that he was very supportive of, a lot of legal immigration, which is new. That little bit of an ad lib line also, I think, surprised some of his supporters and even immigration advocates who look at his record as president and what his administration has done to restrict legal immigration, including cutting refugee numbers and changing policies on how legal immigration visas are adjudicated to, make them harder to get for a lot of people. So that was a little bit of a surprise. But I think overall, I don't think he maybe made the job of the negotiators in Congress any easier. And it's not clear whether he opened the door to any bipartisan compromise or not.
Chris, anything else that stood out for you?
I mean, he laid out a couple of things that he said he would want to see in the deal. But the thing is, these are things we've already saw last month, more or less. I mean, obviously, funding for wall and other border infrastructure, humanitarian aid, additional funding for personnel across the immigration system. But these are things that we've already seen and heard. So if you were thinking, well, maybe he'll come in with a new opening for that could reinforce the bipartisan negotiations that are happening right now in the Senate, you didn't get that much else from there. It just basically just seemed like it was a rehash of what he said. Like Teresa noted, I think the flourish about legal immigration really stood out to a lot of people. And like we said, because the administration has really done a lot of work to really try to limit and restrict legal immigration through regulations, as Teresa noted. What's interesting about that is that, the Trump administration doesn't really talk about legal immigration that much publicly. The focus has always been on illegal immigration. And he's never really touted these regulations at all publicly. So this is why it's interesting that he's kind of stepping into this subject in the way that he did, given that he hasn't made it a part of his key priority. I mean, I think the closest thing we've saw to this was when he was talking about quote unquote chain migration, where he wanted to limit the family reunification system that we have where, U.S. citizens and green card holders can sponsor family members to come here. That was one thing that he was talking about, but he just sort of dropped that off, after a while last year. So it's really interesting to see that.
The other thing I think is notable that he didn't even mention the overtures he made the previous week on DACA and Dreamers. They didn't come up at all in his speech. So again, it seemed like it was more of the same that we've heard from the president overall, and nothing that I think significantly moves the needle. The negotiators are negotiating right now. The hope is that they will have a deal before the government is scheduled to shut down again on the 15th. As of right now, they seem to be working amongst themselves and sort of setting aside the White House and what the president is saying. Day to day, it's reading the tea leaves. Are they sounding positive? Are they not sounding positive? As the day we're recording this, they sound a little more positive that there's something they can come up with. The problem is that really nobody knows at the end of the day whether the president would sign something that this group of negotiators can't agree on.
One of the big questions before the speech was whether or not the president could say anything that would move that process forward and make it easier for that process to succeed. It sounds like I'm hearing you say he didn't achieve that goal.
Yeah, I don't think he did anything that would move it forward. One thing he did not do that a lot of people were afraid of is he did not talk about a national emergency declaration.
Right.
There was a whole flurry of back and forth before the State of the Union. There was perhaps some leaks and perhaps some sense that he might declare the national emergency in the State of the Union, that he was actually going to do that before the negotiations on the Hill had been finished. We have heard that Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell actually inveighed upon the White House to please not do that. There's a lot of concern about the national emergency declaration, including from the president's own party, for a number of reasons, one of which is sort of the use of that authority in this way as a precedent for what future presidents of the other party might do with it, and also just because it doesn't help the negotiations on the Hill. But he did not mention it. I think he still believes that maybe he has that in his back pocket, but maybe that was his way of sort of withholding a little bit and trying not to put that out there for the negotiations. So maybe some people breathed a little bit of a sigh of relief on that one.
I think what was important too is that he didn't even hint as that was an alternative. If you remember his statement after the government was reopened, he made abundantly clear that a national emergency declaration is definitely in the cards, and he made that pretty explicitly. But here it seemed maybe because he was trying to pivot as much as he could to a more broader audience, he wanted to seem a little bit more conciliatory. I mean, now the question is whether or not that will ultimately impact what's happening, after the address. I think that's what's more important. I think it's really a question of whatever comes out of these negotiations, will he accept it? Will he see this as something that will satisfy what he wants? And once again, I don't think we have any indication that he won't take anything less than full funding for his wall, even though apparently right now the negotiators are doing their best to come up with a reasonable compromise between both parties.
Yeah, so we've got this deadline coming up on Friday to come to some sort of agreement to extend government funding. Here's what I don't understand about the emergency declaration. It doesn't solve that problem. That deadline still exists.
Correct. So the president declares a national emergency. That enables him to ostensibly move money and allow Department of Defense, specifically the Army Corps of Engineers, to go build wall without Congress having to pass the appropriation to do it. However, it does not actually pass the appropriation that allows the government to continue operating. That's a separate process that still has to go forward. And you're right, it is kind of unclear what happens after the president, if he declares a national emergency, what happens next on the appropriations process. Our colleague Bill Hoagland, our budget master here, has also said it's not clear what happens then, because it just changes the negotiation, right? The negotiation then may or may not be about border wall funding, but there's still the question of funding the rest of the Department of Homeland Security and the other 8 agencies of government. So potentially they could go back to the agreed upon appropriation from last year for those agencies and maybe a full year continuing resolution for DHS. Or, another question is whether Democrats would respond to the president declaring a national emergency by doing something to deny that on the appropriation. So I think we just don't know. That hasn't been purely gamed out so far. But again, a lot of this is a waiting game and a little bit of a game of chicken, I think, between the White House and Congress as to how this all gets done.
Yeah, so it sounds like even if the president were to declare an emergency, that would not be the end of the story. There are still sort of legislative options available in the House, especially, and there are legal options available as well, correct?
Sure. So Javier Becerra, the California Attorney General and former member of Congress, gave the Spanish language rebuttal to the State of the Union and made very clear that if the president were to declare a state of emergency, he, on behalf of the state of California, would sue to stop that. So he threw that down that gauntlet. The National Emergencies Act, which is the law that ostensibly the president would use, actually allows Congress to pass a resolution of disapproval, if you will, of the emergency, to cancel the emergency, and that can be pushed and made to come to the floor with simple majority of votes. So if Nancy Pelosi in the House decided to pass that with Democratic votes, it would almost be a necessity for Mitch McConnell to put that on the floor, and he has expressed concern that he may not be able to hold all Republicans in line on that. The president could lose that vote. So that's one of the concerns that he had. So there are a lot of other things that could happen. I think that's one of the reasons maybe that the president did not talk about it last night. And we actually haven't heard about him talk about it, the day after the speech either. So we'll see if it comes back into his regular dialogue.
It's a real question of whether or not he's going to be more proactive in saying, I'm going to declare a national emergency and kind of try to goad the negotiations forward, or whether he's going to be more of in wait-and-see mode. And the same can be said for Democrats, because obviously they're going to be negotiating, but I think the party as a whole are going to be taking steps back to think, well, if there's a declaration, what are we going to do legally? And I think that's where we need to see where things go for there.
All right, it's time for a quick break. When we come back, a presidential election in El Salvador and its impacts on migration. And we're back. In recent weeks, Salvadorans went to the polls and chose a new leader. He's Nayib Bukele, a 37-year-old former mayor of the country's capital, San Salvador. And he ran as an outsider to the country's two main parties. Among his promises were to create more jobs and lure people away from gangs and cartels through better economic opportunity. So, Chris, given that so many Salvadorans have already fled due to the extreme violence and poverty, how will this election reverberate beyond El Salvador's borders?
This is really important because you've discussed in this podcast about the flows of Central American migrants, a lot of them coming from El Salvador. This has been a case that we've seen since 2014. So one of the things is, why are they fleeing? And that's the conditions in the country, obviously high levels of violence, corruption, and poverty. And so when you have an election like this, where the possibility of a government coming in and trying to change, adopt policies and try to change the conditions that generate migration to the United States, I think that that's really important. Now, what is the new president promising to do? He ran as an outsider on a campaign against corruption. That was his real, entree into this election. He was able to beat out his two rivals from the two major political parties, Arena on the right and FMLN on the left, on this message saying, I'm going to fight corruption. This is going to be the way I'm going to change this country. And I think it was very successful. I mean, he ended up getting, I believe, over 50% of the vote, very much attracted a whole swath of individuals from the country, including a lot of young people in the country who were a little bit disaffected from politics and the corruption that they see with the two major parties. So it's going to be interesting to see what he's going to do to change those conditions.
What are Salvadorans looking for Bukele to do to change those conditions?
I think, just simply put, they want an end to corruption. I think a wide swath of Salvadoran voters are fed up with the level of corruption that they've seen with politicians from both major parties. And Bukele, both through his own unorthodox way of campaigning, he was very much focused on social media and using social media to communicate directly with individuals. But his critiques of both parties as individuals who, quote unquote, steal from the people, for instance, that was one rhetorical device that he used during the course of the campaign. They really want to see him clean up the political system as their main goal. But at the same time, they also want economic opportunities. And of course, security is going to be really important. They definitely want to see the security situation improved in the country. And they felt that, he was the right person for the job. But more than anything else, it was anti-corruption that helped him win the election.
So you mentioned that Bukele was an unorthodox campaigner. Do you expect that he'll be an unorthodox president? And is he going to take a different tack than what his predecessors have done?
So this is where it gets interesting. His position on security issues isn't that different from what the candidates from the other parties were proposing. All three of them were proposing basically preventative measures against gang violence instead of trying to do crackdowns. And that's a recognition that they would have to sort of work, or at least acknowledge the existence and the importance that gangs play in Salvadoran life, for better or worse, that they are a part of the country's fabric. It's something that you need to just simply work with. It's not something that you can necessarily just wipe out away. So in that sense, he's not that different. But on corruption, he wants to bring in, launch a major anti-corruption probe, similar to the one that you see in Guatemala, or saw in Guatemala. It was recently kicked out by the Guatemalan government, but one headed up that can really tackle corruption across the country and launch this major probe. So that, I think, is one of his key campaign platforms, was really doing that. And I think that's where he was able to distinguish himself on that messaging of saying, I'm going to take this on. I'm going to take on corruption. I'm going to do it in a really strong way.
How might the results of this election address the causes of migration in El Salvador, and what else do you see the region needing to do to support Bukele?
So it's going to come down to what the results and the strategies that he's going to be using to address these issues. That's really going to be the most important thing. Well, there's going to be a lot of difficulties. He's coming into the Salvadoran Assembly without a major backing of a major party, and so he's going to have to build coalitions as a result, and that's going to be a major hindrance. But assuming if he's able to tackle some corruption, that might be one way of being able to boost law enforcement against the gangs. For instance, if he's able to improve the capacity to prevent individuals from joining gangs, for instance, that might be something else that would then limit their capacity to just generate violence and extortion that drives a lot of people out. But these are really open questions because we're talking about deep-seated problems. And if you're looking at it more regionally, obviously, I think the United States, as well as the other major countries in the Northern Triangle with Honduras and Guatemala, are just going to have to keep on having a robust discussion about what needs to be done about migrant flows and the conditions in the region. But once again, that extends beyond one person. You're going to need a lot more than that to be able to change what's happening there.
I just want to add, I think, when you look at the individual migrants and why they choose to leave a country, and this isn't just true for Central America, but pretty much anywhere, it boils down to many of them make the decision to leave a place they're at because they feel like they have no hope where they're at. And what we've seen in other places where there's been significant change of elections, sometimes just the advent of a new person in whom there seems to be a modicum of faith and hope that the future will be better can turn the tide, or at least, for a time, reduce the out-migration pushes. But then it's a matter of whether or not that hope turns into reality. And that's what Chris was talking about in terms of the governance. So I think it's important to sort of look over the next few months at the trends from El Salvador and see if it is affecting the migrant flows, and whether or not that hope turns into a reality. But it is something to keep an eye on.
Okay. On the other side of a break, the complex case of 21 Savage and what it says about our broken immigration system. Stick around. Let's wrap up today with a developing story. Last week, ICE agents took Grammy-nominated rapper 21 Savage into custody, charging that he overstayed a visa after entering the United States from the UK in 2005 as a minor, and that he also had a criminal drug conviction. He's now in removal proceedings. Now, 21 Savage's attorney claims his client had a pending application for what's called a U visa, which is used to provide status to victims or witnesses in crimes. The charges took many of 21 Savage's fans by surprise, since he had represented himself in his public life as a young black man raised in Atlanta. There's been no shortage of takes online and in the media about such a high-profile case and what it means for the larger immigration debate. But Teresa, stepping back from the particulars of this specific case, what's the bigger story here, and what does it say about how complex the immigration system is?
So, watching this story evolve over, 24 and then 48 hours. I mean, this arrest took place around the time of the Super Bowl, so there was a lot of attention going on down in Atlanta. Two very high-profile people, 21 Savage and the other rapper that he was arrested with. And there were immediate, sort of guesses about what was going on here and what the status was. We later had his attorney come out with a statement about a U visa. Here's the issue. Setting aside, again, the particulars of his case, is that our immigration system is really complicated, and understanding the exact immigration situation of any individual, be they a famous rapper or, the person who was arrested, at a restaurant, can be very complicated. And what was interesting about this case is that because it grew such national immediate attention, a lot of people in the immigration debate tried to presume or make assumptions about what this case was about, right? Was it about an individual who was picked up and should not have been picked up, was in the wrong time in the wrong place? Was he really an immigrant or an undocumented immigrant? What does it mean if he actually was an immigrant but was raised in Atlanta and people didn't know the difference? Does that make him American? And a lot of people were just sort of trying to latch their own point of view onto this case without having any of the facts of the case. And I think that says a couple of things about. One, it says that our understanding that our immigration system is so complex that without having all the facts, people can just sort of make up things or presume things about somebody's status or position. And the fact that nobody can really understand what the complexities are is a problem for our system in itself. And then the flip side of that is the idea that we can use any single case as an example of what we should or shouldn't do with our immigration system, right? Our immigration system is very complex. And for every exemplar case on one side of an issue, there's probably another exemplar case on another side of the issue. Anecdotes don't help us understand what we really need broadly as a policy because they may not be representative of the entire spectrum of issues that need to be addressed. So this is sort of a microcosm for the larger immigration debate that's happening in this country that's sometimes devoid of detail on policy and a lot about presumptions of what the system actually is that we need to sort of pay attention to, I think.
It's funny because anybody who's been trained as an immigration attorney or immigration paralegal will take classes on doing interviews for clients. And there's a whole step-by-step process to get the full facts of the case about the individual before you can make a determination about what options they can pursue for whatever immigration benefits that they're seeking. This is training. This takes time, this takes effort, this takes a lot of energy to be able to see the facts of a case and then apply it to law, precedent, regulations. And so when you're trying to do this with a high-profile case, this is something that you'd have to do over multiple meetings if you're just an immigration attorney or paralegal. But we're doing it in public, and I think the fact that people are trying to do this so quickly with such a complex case kind of shows that every single case is going to have a wrinkle. You can't just have a generalization. I mean, there's a lot more work that goes into this as a result, and I think everybody will have their take, but the question is, what are the facts of the case? And you realize the case will shift from case to case to case. There's no one single immigration case. It's just individuals.
There were a lot of armchair immigration attorneys out in the world trying to ascertain his status and what was going on. And, I think that's part and parcel of the problem.
Yeah, that comes back to a point that you made earlier, which is that so many people jumped on this story to try to make claims about the broader immigration debate in this country. So some were upset that he hid his identity as an immigrant and essentially pretended to be an American. Others claimed that because he had overstayed and had a drug conviction that he should be deported without question. And some immigration advocates are trying to use this story to support broader Dreamer issues. So how do these high-profile cases impact the state of play in the broader national immigration debate?
Well, as I said earlier, everyone is looking for sort of that quintessential case, that quintessential factual situation that can make their rhetorical case for them. So, for example, going back to the 2016 election, President Trump clung to the case of Kate Steinle in San Francisco, right? The young woman who was killed by an undocumented immigrant. And he said, used it as an example of why we need to crack down on illegal immigration and we shouldn't allow illegal immigrant criminals around. When that case actually went to trial, the immigrant was acquitted in part because the jury found that the shooting was completely accidental. So the facts of a case do not necessarily end up reflecting, the broader point that people want to make. And there's a danger in using too many anecdotes to try to prove a particular point of view on immigration. Besides that, it's just true that for every anecdote on one side of a debate, there's probably going to be an anecdote on the other side of the debate. And that doesn't necessarily tell you anything about what the true set of situations are. We've had this conversation before where the plural of anecdote is not data. So any single story can give you a skewed picture of what the totality is because you're only looking at a very small piece of the puzzle. In this case, we have one case of one individual. We did not know or have all of the facts about what his immigration status was or was not, or what relief from removal might be available to him. We didn't even know whether ICE had all of the truth, right? We found out later that he had a legal visa application pending, right? And ICE apparently did not know that or didn't talk about that. So even within the case, not everybody had the full story. And that should be, I think, that's one of the things that it's important that people hear stories that can try to explain our complicated immigration system. But we need to be careful not to put too much emphasis on a story as the reason why we should do X or Y.
I think that's a really important point, because I think where the immigration debate has been using individual stories to highlight the struggles of a particular class of individuals. So, for instance, dreamers and DACA recipients, don't deport them. They've been here for a very long time. They deserve a legal pathway to citizenship and so forth. Or you have on the other side, constant anecdotes about individuals who are non-citizens who committed crimes. This whole debate has sort of been shifting from maybe a broad discussion about immigration to a discussion about immigrants. And as advocacy groups on both sides have been using sort of those anecdotes to really try to drive what they want to see done in the immigration system, as a result, you have instances like this that can just kind of be fit into boxes. The problem, of course, is you're fitting them into the boxes, but you're not really helping people get a clarity understanding of how this whole system works. You get a sense of where the sides are in the debate, but you actually don't get a sense of the system and its functioning. And you don't get the sense of the system and its limitations or potential fixes. So I think that this is, it's not just limited to immigration, obviously criminal justice reform or gun violence, or like a lot of these emotional issues are always driven by anecdotes. But I think with immigration, because advocates have made stories of immigrants such an important part of their strategy, that it ignites fire as a result.
I'm curious also what this case says about how a person's legal status intersects with their identity as part of the fabric of American life. I mean, part of what made this case such a national sensation was the surprise at learning that 21 Savage was an immigrant when he had portrayed himself as being an American, and these questions of what exactly is American identity and how do we define that?
I think this is always going to be an existential question for the United States, just given our long legacy of being a country of immigration. I will say that with the rise of the Dreamer movement, the DACA movement, these kids have come out and said, "I'm American regardless of my legal status," and they've talked about their processes almost of coming out, embracing their public identity as Americans who are undocumented. And so I think the fact that they've made this so part and parcel with their own identity, that I think people are starting to become a little bit more comfortable with the idea that you could potentially be undocumented but still be an American. That doesn't mean everybody's going to accept it, but I think that they've put a face to sort of what it means to be undocumented and American, which I don't think you would have seen in prior generations of immigrant rights activists, much less the immigrants themselves. So I think by putting this out there, I think for some people it may be the case that, like, okay, yeah, you might be an American. I think I'm hearing a lot about this from these dreamers and these DACA recipients. Sure thing. I mean, not to say that everybody accepts that, but I think it certainly has shifted over the last 15 years or so because of these activists.
Well, and I think on a broader question, I mean, at its root, a lot of the debate about immigration is about American identity. It's about who is American, who do we allow and want to become American, and what does that process look like? And I think in this particular case, there's a couple things. One is you can't tell by looking at somebody in the United States who is an American and who is not. Because we do have a history of immigration and we do have such diversity in this country. And the people you presume may be American may not be American. And the people you presume are not American may in fact be American. And that should be, I think, a word of caution to everybody about making assumptions in this immigration debate, which is back to where we started. You can't make assumptions about anybody's individual case or individual status. You can't assume that an individual case or status is representative of the whole or can be the thing that will automatically drive a particular policy issue. And lastly, in terms of figuring out, who is or isn't American, you can't make assumptions on superficial things there.
Well, I want to thank you both as always for joining me, and thanks to you all for listening. We'll be back in 2 weeks. In the meantime, please take a second to find us on Facebook by searching Bipartisan Policy Center or on Twitter at BPC_bipartisan. And don't forget to subscribe and leave your feedback on this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Just search Bipartisan Policy Center. This episode of This Week in Immigration was written by Chris Ramone, Teresa Cardinal Brown, and myself, and produced by Beth Schneider. That's all for now. Join us again next time on This Week in Immigration.